Victor Harrow didn't knock. He never did. He shoved open the door of Caleb Rowan's barn like he owned it, because in his mind, he already did. He dropped a folded paper onto the hay-strewn floor at Caleb's boots and said, with the particular smile of a man who has never once been told no, "Sign it today, or I'll have my men divert that creek by Friday. Your cattle will be dead before the first frost." Caleb stared at the paper. His hands were still. His jaw was tight. He had a 5-year-old daughter sleeping in the house 30 yards away, a ranch teetering on the edge of ruin, and a bride arriving on tomorrow's train, a woman he had never met and didn't know how to knead. He did not sign, but Victor was already walking away, whistling. If you have ever stood at the edge of losing everything, the land, the child, the last thread of the life you built, and had to decide in one breath whether to fight or fold, then you already know what kind of story this is. Stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single chapter of what happens next. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it truly began. The telegram had arrived on a Tuesday, which Caleb Rowan would later think of as the last ordinary day of his life. He had been out mending the south fence when his neighbor's boy, a gap-toothed 12-year-old named Pete Garvey, came galloping up the hill with the yellow envelope flapping in his hand. Caleb took it without much feeling. He'd been expecting word from the Hartwell Marriage Agency for weeks, confirmation that a woman named Clara Deeds would be arriving on the Thursday train from Cincinnati. He had read her letter 3 times. She sounded practical, capable, not romantic, which suited him fine. Romance was a thing that belonged to a different version of Caleb Rowan, the one who existed before his wife Margaret died of fever 18 months ago and left him alone with a child and a ranch and a silence so thick he sometimes couldn't hear himself think. He tore open the envelope expecting a travel schedule. What he got instead was this. Dear Mr. Rowan, we regret to inform you that Miss Clara Deeds has entered into a marriage arrangement with another gentleman prior to her scheduled departure. In accordance with our agency's commitment to fulfill all contracted arrangements, we are pleased to offer you our next available candidate, Miss Naomi Ashford of Philadelphia, who will arrive on schedule Thursday at 2 o'clock. Miss Ashford comes highly recommended. We trust this substitution will prove satisfactory. Caleb read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket and went back to mending the fence, because the fence still needed mending regardless of what any agency in the East thought was satisfactory. That evening, after Elsie was asleep, his daughter, who slept with her fist pressed against her cheek and her brown hair spread out like a fan across the pillow, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with the lamp burning low and looked at the letter again. He didn't know what to feel about it. He hadn't exactly felt much of anything since Margaret, at least not in any organized way. He felt the cold in January. He felt the ache in his back after a 12-hour day. He felt the particular hollow that opened up in his chest every time Elsie asked a question that started with, "Why doesn't Mama?" and then trailed off because she already knew the answer and didn't want to say it out loud. He hadn't chosen to reach out to the agency because he wanted a wife. He had done it because Elsie needed a woman in the house. Someone steady. Someone who knew how to braid hair and explain things he didn't know how to explain. Clara Deeds had seemed like she might be that person. She'd written clearly, spelled everything right, said she was unafraid of hard work and cold weather. He knew nothing about Naomi Ashford except that she came from Philadelphia, which was not a good sign. Philadelphia women did not typically thrive in Red Hollow, Wyoming in 1884. He had seen 2 of them pass through on their way west, and both had turned right around at the sight of the mud on Main Street. He nearly wrote back to the agency that night to cancel the arrangement entirely. He didn't, because he couldn't think of a good enough reason that didn't sound like cowardice. Red Hollow was not a town that impressed itself upon visitors. It sat in a shallow valley between 2 ridgelines, close enough to the mountains that the cold came early and stayed late. There were 3 streets, a general store run by a man named Otis Pratt, who also served as the unofficial postmaster, a livery stable, a barber shop that doubled as a dentist's office, and a saloon that the town's 12 church-going women pretended did not exist. The train stopped there twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, to take on water, drop mail, and occasionally release a passenger who had either made a very deliberate choice or a very serious mistake. Caleb arrived at the station Thursday at 1:30. He had put on his better shirt, which was only marginally better than his working shirt, and he had run a wet comb through his hair, which had not cooperated. He was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had started out pleasant enough, but had been worked over by weather and grief until it settled into something more serious than handsome. His hands were permanently rough. He had tried scrubbing them that morning and given up. He told himself he was not nervous. He was not the kind of man who got nervous about things. He had once treated his own injured hand alone at the kitchen table with a bottle of whiskey and a clean cloth and not made a sound. Waiting for a train was not the same category of event. He was, however, standing close enough to the tracks that Pete Garvey's mother, who happened to be waiting for a package from her sister, gave him a long considering look and then said, "She'll be fine, Caleb, whoever she is." He said, "I'm not worried." Mrs. Garvey's expression indicated that she did not believe him, and also that she did not blame him. The train came in 8 minutes late, which was actually early by Red Hollow's standards. Steam billowed up over the platform. 3 men got off carrying crates, then an older couple who turned out to be passing through to Cheyenne, and then, after a pause that Caleb would later remember as strangely suspended, like the moment before a door closes, a woman stepped down onto the platform. She was not what he had been picturing. He had been picturing something sturdy, sensible. A woman who looked like she had spent time outdoors and didn't mind it. Clara Deeds had struck him that way from her letter, though he had never seen her face. Naomi Ashford was slight and straight-backed, with dark hair pinned up under a hat that was considerably nicer than anything worn in Red Hollow on a regular basis. She was carrying one large bag and a smaller leather satchel over her arm, and she was scanning the platform with an expression that was carefully, deliberately neutral. Not frightened, not excited, just taking it in, reading the situation. She had the kind of stillness about her that Caleb associated with people who had learned not to show too much too fast. She spotted him before he reached her, which meant she must have done some reading of her own. Probably identified him by the fact that he was the only man on the platform wearing a clean shirt and looking deeply uncomfortable. "Mr. Rowan," she said. "Miss Ashford." He stopped a few feet away. "The agency wrote. I got the letter." "I assumed." She didn't extend her hand, and neither did he, which created a brief standoff that neither of them acknowledged. "I hope the change in arrangement wasn't too disruptive." "It was a surprise," he said, which was the honest answer. She looked at him steadily. "I can be honest with you, if you prefer that to politeness." "I prefer it," he said. "Then I'll tell you that I was the agency's second choice for this placement, and I'm aware of that. And I'll tell you that I'm not Clara Deeds, and I don't know what she promised you, but I'm here and I intend to make that worth something." She shifted the bag on her shoulder. "Now, is there a way to carry these bags, or do I manage them myself?" He reached out and took the large one without answering. She followed him to the wagon without any further discussion, which he found he appreciated more than he'd expected. Elsie had not been told about the change in arrangement. She had been told, several weeks ago, that a woman named Clara was coming to live with them, and she had greeted this information with the particular gravity that 5-year-olds reserve for things they consider very serious indeed. She had made up her mind about it quickly, the way children do, decided it was a good thing, a decided thing, and filed it away. Clara was coming. Clara would have brown hair like Mama. Clara would know how to make apple cake. These were not facts she had been given. They were facts she had decided. Caleb had not thought through the implications of this until Naomi stepped down from the wagon and Elsie came running out of the house where she had been waiting with Martha Garvey as a temporary minder, and Elsie stopped 6 feet short of the porch steps and stared. Naomi Ashford had dark hair, not brown. She was thinner than the woman Elsie had apparently assembled in her imagination. She was wearing a city dress with small buttons at the wrists. Elsie stared at her. Naomi stared back with exactly the same level of attention, neither condescending nor uncomfortable, just looking. Then Elsie said with great deliberateness, "You're not Clara." "No," Naomi said. "Clara wasn't able to come. I'm Naomi." "Why not?" "She married someone else first." Elsie thought about this. "Did she like him better?" I don't know her reasons," Naomi said honestly. Another pause. Caleb had started to move toward the house to intervene in whatever this was becoming, but something made him stop and watch. Elsie crossed the remaining 6 feet and looked up at Naomi with an expression that was slightly too old for her face. Then she reached out and took Naomi's gloved hand in both of her small ones and said, very seriously, "That's all right. I think you were supposed to come instead." Naomi's expression shifted, just slightly, just for a moment, into something that hadn't been there before, something not carefully neutral. "I think you might be right," she said. Caleb watched his daughter lead this stranger he had not chosen toward the front door of his house, and felt something he couldn't name move through him. Not warmth exactly, more like the beginning of the possibility of warmth, which was not the same thing at all, and he was careful not to confuse the two. The house was not good. He knew it wasn't good. He had known it for a year and a half and had done the bare minimum required to keep the roof functional and the stove working, and hadn't done much else, because doing more had felt like a kind of betrayal he couldn't articulate. Margaret had made this house into something. He had watched it slowly become less than that, and had not done the things required to stop it. Naomi walked through the front room without saying anything. She looked at the patched curtains hanging crooked in the window. She looked at the stack of harness parts that had lived on the table for 3 months because there was nowhere else to put them. She looked at the children's picture Elsie had drawn and tacked to the wall because she had wanted it there, and Caleb hadn't been able to refuse her anything. She set her bags down by the door. "Which room is mine?" she asked. He showed her the back room. It had been Margaret's sewing room. He had cleared it out 2 weeks ago when he'd confirmed the arrangement with the agency, moved everything to the barn, told himself he felt nothing about it. There was a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out toward the east pasture. Naomi stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment. "This is fine," she said. "It's not much." "No." She turned and looked at him directly. "But I've slept in worse and complained less. Thank you for making it ready." He didn't know what to say to that. He said, "Supper's usually around 6. I can manage it tonight." "I'll manage it," she said. "You don't have to—" "Mr. Rowan," she said it calmly, without sharpness. "I came here to be useful. Standing in a doorway watching you cook won't accomplish that. Is there a larder?" There was. He showed her. She cooked that first night without asking him anything, working in the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to find her way around unfamiliar spaces. Biscuits. Salt pork. Beans that had been soaking. Caleb sat at the kitchen table going over the month's expenses and tried not to watch her work, and failed at least 4 times. Elsie planted herself on the stool by the stove and talked steadily, which she did when she was making up her mind about something. She told Naomi about the gray cat that lived in the barn. She told Naomi about the creek that ran at the edge of the south pasture, which she was not allowed to go near alone. She told Naomi that her father made biscuits that were sometimes very hard, a fact which she delivered without diplomatic softening and which Caleb pretended not to hear. Naomi listened to all of it. She asked one question: "What's the cat's name?" And when Elsie said solemnly, "Thomas, but he doesn't really come to it," Naomi said, "Most cats don't," in a tone that suggested she considered this a reasonable character trait. Supper was edible in a way Caleb's cooking recently had not been. Elsie ate her biscuits without commentary. Naomi ate with her eyes on her plate and said almost nothing, which he was grateful for, because he didn't have anything to say, and the quiet was at least honest. When Elsie was put to bed, and she allowed Naomi to take her, which surprised him, because she was particular about these things. Caleb sat alone at the table and tried to figure out what he felt about the fact that a woman he had never intended to meet was now asleep in Margaret's sewing room. He couldn't figure it out. He poured himself a small measure of whiskey, didn't drink it, and went to bed. What Naomi Ashford was not was what she appeared. This was not deception. She had not misrepresented herself in her agency correspondence, which had been brief and careful and entirely accurate. She had written that she was 28 years old, unmarried, experienced in household management, and seeking a permanent arrangement in a frontier setting. All of this was true. What she had not written, what the agency had not asked, and she had not volunteered, was that she had spent the past 3 years as the household manager for a Philadelphia family with 5 children and a social calendar that would have broken most people, and that she had left that position not because she was dismissed, but because the family patriarch had come to consider her position in the household differently than she did, and she had not been interested in renegotiating the terms. She had not written that she came from a family that had once had money and then very suddenly did not, and that the years between that loss and her current situation had been educational in a way that formal schooling is not, teaching her the particular skills of a person who cannot afford to show fear. She had not written that she had wanted to go west for years before necessity made the decision feel less like adventure and more like arithmetic. She lay in the narrow bed in the sewing room on that first night and listened to the sounds of the ranch, wind, an animal moving in the barn, the creak of a house settling in the cold. And she thought carefully about where she was and what she had said and what she had not said and what came next. She was not frightened. She was, and this was a distinction she made clearly and specifically, uncertain. Uncertain about the man who had shown her nothing yet except silence and a kind of banked-down grief that she recognized and did not intend to pry at. Uncertain about the child, who was too perceptive for her age and had already decided things that Naomi hadn't decided yet. Uncertain about what exactly this frontier town in Wyoming demanded of people, and whether what she was capable of matched those demands. She had never met a person who thrived by underestimating what a situation required. She did not intend to be the first. In the morning, she was up before the sun and had the stove going before Caleb came down from his room. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at her as though recalculating something. "I woke early," she said. "I can see that. The water barrel's low. I noticed it last night. I'll haul from the creek this morning." "All right." She handed him a cup of coffee, which he took. He stood at the window with the cup and looked out at the early dark, and she went back to stirring the porridge, and neither of them said anything, and it was not comfortable exactly. It was more like two people deciding simultaneously not to make things harder than they already were, which is its own kind of beginning. The trouble with Victor Harrow began the following Monday. Caleb had not mentioned Victor Harrow in his agency correspondence. He had not mentioned the creek dispute or the property line disagreement, or the fact that Harrow had been applying pressure, in his particular indirect way, for the better part of 6 months. These were his problems. He had not asked a stranger to share them. Victor Harrow was 43, a landowner of consequence in the Red Hollow Valley, and a man who had constructed his entire conception of himself around the premise that he was owed more than he currently had. He had a legitimate operation, cattle, mostly, some horses. But legitimate was never quite enough for him. What he wanted was the creek. The Rowan Creek ran through the south pasture and into Harrow's upper grazing fields, but the water rights belonged entirely to Caleb's family, which had been a source of quiet, accumulating resentment in Harrow for years. What had once been quiet resentment had lately been converting into strategy. Caleb had told no one about the Monday meeting because he had not expected it to be what it turned out to be. Victor came to the ranch in a suit, which was the first warning sign. Men in Red Hollow did not wear suits to neighboring ranches unless they were there to negotiate something they wanted to look official about. He came with a man named Fowler, who was introduced as his legal representative, which was the second warning sign, and which Caleb clocked without expression. Naomi was inside the house. Elsie was at the Garvey place for the morning. Caleb met Harrow at the fence line between the barn and the yard, which put them in the open and not in the house, which was a deliberate choice. "Caleb," Harrow said warmly, because Harrow was a man who used warmth like a tool. "Looking well." "Victor," Caleb looked at Fowler. "Counselor." Fowler nodded with the expression of a man being paid to stand quietly and look authoritative. "Heard you got married," Harrow said. "Mail order affair. Good for you. Getting lonely out here." "What can I do for you, Victor?" Harrow smiled in the way of a man who has no problem taking his time, because time costs him nothing. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document and held it out. "Got a surveyor's report, re-examination of the property lines on your south quarter. Turns out the boundary markers from the original survey were placed wrong, about 30 feet off." He tapped the document. "Creek's on my side, Caleb, technically. Hate to bring that up, but there it is." Caleb did not take the document. "Who commissioned the survey?" "Independent firm, out of Cheyenne." "Independent," Caleb repeated. "Everything's in the report." Caleb looked at Harrow. He looked at Fowler. He looked at the document, which was still extended toward him, and did not take it. "I'll want to look at it," he said. "I'll want to compare it to my original survey." "Of course," Harrow said. "Take your time. You've got—" He appeared to consider. "Until Friday. After that, we'll need to start discussing water diversion, practically speaking." "Friday," Caleb said. "Hate to rush you, but the lawyers have deadlines." Harrow smiled again, the specific smile of a man dropping a problem on someone else's floor. "Give my congratulations to your wife." He left the document on the fence post. He and Fowler walked back to their horses. Caleb stood in the yard and watched them go, and the quiet afterward was a different kind of quiet than the one he'd gotten used to. He picked up the document and walked back toward the house. Naomi was at the kitchen window. She had been there long enough to see most of it. When he came inside, she was standing at the table, not pretending she hadn't been watching. "That was Victor Harrow," she said. Not a question. "How do you know his name?" "Mrs. Garvey mentioned him when she brought Elsie over this morning. She mentioned him the way people mention things they think you should already know." Caleb set the document on the table. He did not offer it to her because he was still thinking about whether the conversation he was about to have was a conversation he was prepared to have. Naomi looked at the document and then at him, and then sat down across the table with her hands folded and waited. He sat down. "He's claiming the creek is on his property," Caleb said. "He's got a survey that says the boundary markers were placed wrong in the original survey." "Is that possible?" "The original survey was done in 1871, before I bought the place. I have a copy of it." "And does it match his?" "I don't know yet. I haven't opened his document." "Then we should open it," she said. He looked at her. She was sitting across the table from him with the same expression she'd had when she stepped off the train. Not frightened, not putting on a performance of calm. Actually calm. In the way that comes from having already decided you're going to deal with whatever you're looking at. He opened the document. They looked at it together for 40 minutes. Naomi was not a surveyor and neither was Caleb, but she had a sharper eye for inconsistency than he would have expected, and she caught two things he almost missed: a discrepancy in the elevation notation and a reference to a landmark that she said flatly could not be the same landmark described in the original survey because the measurements didn't line up. "He's had someone alter this," she said. "I can't prove that." "Not today," she said. "But it's altered. Someone who knew what they were doing, but not well enough." She looked at him. "Do you have a lawyer?" "Closest one is in Cheyenne." "Then we write to him tonight," she said, as though this were simply the next step in a sequence, and moved to stand up. "Naomi." She stopped. "This isn't your problem to carry," he said. He meant it as a courtesy. It came out sounding like something else, something more like an apology. She stood very still for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Rowan, I came here because I was going to marry someone on this ranch. I didn't come here to live in a separate box from whatever the ranch is dealing with. That's not a life, that's just—" She paused, choosing words. "That's just staying somewhere." He had nothing to say to that. "So we write to the lawyer tonight," she said again, "and tomorrow you pull your original survey from wherever you've got it filed, and I'll look at both of them again and write down every discrepancy I can find." "You think you can find enough?" "I think," she said carefully, "that a man who would fake a survey to steal a creek from a man with a 5-year-old child is probably not as thorough as he thinks he is. And I think that matters." He let her write the letter. He sat at the table while she did it, reading and rereading his original survey documents, and outside the wind came up across the valley the way it did in October, carrying cold from the mountains, and inside the lamp held steady. And the letter that Naomi Ashford wrote to the lawyer in Cheyenne was precise and clear and did not use a single unnecessary word. He read it before she folded it. "This is good," he said. "I know," she said. Not arrogantly, just accurately. He thought about the woman the agency had originally sent him toward, Clara Deeds, who was now someone else's wife, who had seemed practical and capable from her letters. He thought about the fact that practical and capable had now been sitting across from him at his kitchen table for 6 days and had just spotted a fraudulent survey notation that he had almost missed, and had written a legal letter without breaking stride, and had done all of it without once suggesting he was lucky she was here. He was beginning to think he was lucky she was here. He was careful, however, not to say this out loud, because saying things out loud made them real in ways that were not always convenient for a man who was still carrying more than he knew how to set down. That Friday, Victor Harrow came back. He did not come alone. He brought Fowler and 2 other men, hands from his operation, large and quiet in the way of men who are brought to places not to speak, but to change the atmosphere of a room. Caleb was at the barn when they arrived. Naomi was in the house. By the time Caleb crossed the yard, Naomi was already on the porch. She had not hidden inside. She had come to the door, opened it, and placed herself in the frame of it, and was watching Harrow's party approach with the same particular focused stillness with which she looked at everything. She had her arms at her sides. She looked, Caleb thought later, like someone who had walked into an unfamiliar room and made up her mind within 30 seconds about where she stood in relation to everything else in it. Harrow looked at her. She looked back. "Mrs. Rowan," Harrow said, with the easy courtesy of a man accustomed to using women's presence as an audience rather than a variable. "Mr. Harrow," she said. He looked past her at the door, then back at Caleb, then at the door again. "Is there somewhere we can talk, Caleb? Inside, maybe?" "We can talk here," Caleb said. Harrow's expression adjusted slightly. He looked at Naomi again with a calculation he was making no effort to hide. He had, Caleb understood, made the mistake of assuming she was a variable that didn't matter. "Got a letter from your lawyer in Cheyenne," Harrow said. "I know, he told me he sent it. He's asking for a delay. Says you want a second survey commissioned." "That's what I want," Caleb said. Harrow smiled. "Caleb, look, I understand. A man in your situation wants to be sure of things. New wife, running a ranch alone." He spread his hands. "This doesn't need to be difficult. The survey is clear we could settle this privately between neighbors, spare both of us the lawyers." "What kind of settlement did you have in mind?" Caleb asked. "I take over the water rights, pay you a fair price for the creek access, and you keep the ranch. Everyone walks away whole." Caleb looked at him. "That creek is how I water my cattle November through April, when the upper wells freeze," he said. "That creek is why my family bought this land in 1871. "I understand that." "I don't think you do," Caleb said. "Because if you did, you wouldn't have driven out here a second time with this same conversation." Harrow's pleasant expression developed, for the first time, a thin, cold edge. "I'm trying to be reasonable." "You're trying to take my property with a survey that doesn't match the original markers," Naomi said. The sentence landed quietly. Harrow turned to look at her as though she had done something unexpected, which she had, in his calculation of the situation. "Mrs. Rowan," he said. "I've compared your document to the original," she said. "The elevation notation on the south boundary marker doesn't match the terrain as it currently exists, which means someone measured from a different reference point than the 1871 survey. Deliberately or incompetently, I don't know which, but either way the documents don't agree." The yard was very quiet. One of Harrow's men shifted his weight. Fowler looked at the ground with the expression of a man whose client has just complicated his afternoon. Harrow looked at Naomi for a long moment. He looked at her the way men look at things that were not supposed to be obstacles. Then he looked back at Caleb. "You've got until the end of the month," he said. The warmth was gone from his voice. "Then we proceed through the court." He turned and walked back to his horse. His men followed. Fowler followed last, and he looked back once at Naomi, and his expression was something she catalogued without reacting to. When they were gone, Caleb stood in the yard and exhaled slowly. Naomi was still on the porch. She had not moved from the doorframe. "That was reckless," he said. Not angrily, honestly. "It was calculated," she said. He looked at her. "If he thought you were alone in this, he would keep coming back with different versions of the same offer until you were tired enough to take one. He needed to know you weren't alone." She paused. "I might have been wrong." "You weren't wrong," he said. She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded once and went back inside. He stood in the yard a moment longer, in the cold autumn air, looking at the place where Harrow's horses had disturbed the dust on the road, and he thought about a woman stepping off a train 3 weeks ago who was the agency's second choice, and what second choice meant, and whether it meant anything at all when the outcome was what it was. He went back to work. But the shape of things had shifted imperceptibly, like the angle of light in the late afternoon. Still the same light, but landing differently now, making the familiar look like something you might not have properly seen before. The letter to Cheyenne went out on a Saturday, which meant it would not arrive until Wednesday at the earliest, and the lawyer's response would not come back until the following week, which left a gap of time in which Caleb had nothing to do about Victor Harrow except wait and work and try not to think too carefully about what the end of the month meant if the survey dispute didn't resolve in his favor. He was not good at waiting, he was better at work, and so he worked, harder than he had to, longer than was probably useful, the way a man does when he is using physical exhaustion to keep a different kind of exhaustion at bay. He was up before light every morning and out to the barn before Naomi had the stove going, and he stayed in the fields until the cold made it impractical to continue. And he came back to the house with the particular quiet of a man who has decided not to talk about the thing he is most worried about. Naomi did not push him on it. She was not the pushing kind, which he was beginning to understand was not the same as not noticing. She noticed everything. She had simply made a decision, early, not to make him feel observed. What she did instead was work. The house had been in the slow decline that overtakes a place when the person who cared most about it is gone, and the person remaining is surviving rather than living. Caleb had kept it functional. He had not kept it whole. Naomi, without comment or agenda, began to correct this. Not all at once, not with the energy of someone making a point, but steadily, the way water moves around an obstacle. She rehung the curtains straight. She cleaned the lamp chimneys so the light in the evenings was fuller. She found a crack in the kitchen wall where cold air was coming through and stuffed it with rags until the proper material could be sourced from Otis Pratt's store. She reorganized the larder in a way that made it possible to see what they had and what they needed, which turned out to be more than Caleb had been tracking. She did not ask him before she did any of this. She had assessed, decided, and acted, the same sequence she appeared to apply to most things. And when Caleb came in one evening and noticed the curtains were no longer crooked, he stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and said nothing. And she waited to see if he would say something, and when he didn't, she went back to the stove. Later that night he said, "The curtains." "Yes," she said. "Margaret put those up," he said. It was the first time he had said her name in Naomi's presence. Naomi was quiet for a moment. "I can take them down if you'd rather they stayed as they were." "No," he said after a pause. She'd have hated them crooked. That was the end of that conversation. But something in the room had shifted, very slightly, the way a door shifts when the latch releases. It hasn't opened yet, but the resistance is gone. Elsie had developed the habit of following Naomi around the house in the mornings. She did this with a persistence that was not precisely intrusive. She stayed close enough to be present and far enough away to suggest that she was simply going in the same direction, which was Elsie's characteristic approach to most things she wanted. She had her mother's brown hair and her father's serious eyes, and a quality of observation that made grown adults occasionally feel they were being evaluated more thoroughly than they were comfortable with. She was not hostile to Naomi, which Caleb had been braced for. She was something stranger than hostile. She was proprietary. She had decided, in the way she had apparently decided many things, that Naomi was a fixed feature of her world, and she organized herself around this decision with the authority of a 5-year-old who has no concept of provisional. On a Tuesday morning 3 weeks in, Elsie positioned herself on the kitchen stool and watched Naomi mend a tear in one of Caleb's work shirts and said, with no preamble, "Do you know how to braid?" "Yes," Naomi said without looking up. "Mama used to braid my hair. Papa tries, but it comes out wrong." A pause. He pulls. "Braiding takes practice," Naomi said. "Can you practice on me?" Naomi put down the shirt and looked at her. "Right now?" "If you're not busy." "I'm mending." "Is mending more important than braiding?" Naomi considered this with the gravity it apparently deserved. "Not at this moment," she said, and set the shirt aside. Caleb came in from the barn 15 minutes later to find Elsie sitting very straight on a kitchen chair with Naomi standing behind her, working through her hair with a comb, and the expression on Elsie's face was one of concentrated bliss. The particular expression of a child receiving something they had been trying not to want too much, in case it didn't come. He stood in the doorway longer than he needed to. Then he went out again without making a sound. The winter preparation was the task that made things real. In Red Hollow, the window between the last warm days and the first hard freeze was narrow and unforgiving, and what you had stored and sealed and secured before it closed was what determined whether the season killed you or merely inconvenienced you. Caleb had survived 2 winters alone, the second one worse than the first, because the first one he had still been moving on momentum from Margaret's preparations, and the second one he had had to figure out from scratch what she had known automatically. This year Naomi came into it with a comprehensiveness that surprised him. She went through the larder with a list she made herself, cross-referencing what they had against what a winter of 3 people required, and she presented Caleb with the shortfall without editorial comment, just the numbers, just the items. Root vegetables, dried beans, salted meat, coal oil. He looked at the list and felt something he didn't immediately identify, and then identified it as relief. The specific relief of a man who has been carrying a calculation alone and has just been handed a second pair of hands. They went to Otis Pratt's store together on a Thursday, which was unusual enough that Mrs. Garvey and a woman named Helen Marsh were both in the store at the same time and took note of it in the way that people take note of things in small towns. Not rudely, but thoroughly, with the intention of understanding what they were looking at. Naomi moved through the store with her list and did not look around for social navigation. She found what she needed, assessed what she couldn't find, and asked Otis Pratt direct questions that Otis Pratt answered with slightly more detail than he usually bothered with, because she asked as if the answers mattered. Helen Marsh ended up beside Naomi at the dry goods counter and said, with the friendliness of a woman who is also conducting an assessment, "You're Caleb's wife. The mail order." "Yes," Naomi said. "I'm Helen Marsh. My husband has the farrier operation on Mill Road." "Naomi Rowan," Naomi said, which was the first time Caleb had heard her use his name as her own, and it landed somewhere in him without his permission. Helen looked at the list in Naomi's hand. "You're doing the winter stores?" "Yes." "Smart to get it done early. Some years the road from Cheyenne closes before November." Helen paused. "Victor Harrow been out to your place?" Naomi looked at her. "Why do you ask?" "He's been out to 3 other ranches this year with surveys and lawyers. The Brennan place and the 2 Hooper brothers on the north side." Helen kept her voice level, informational. "He didn't get anywhere with any of them. The Brennans had to go to court about it. Cost them most of a season's profits." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "What happened with the survey dispute?" "Judge in Cheyenne found for the Brennans. Harrow's survey had errors." Helen said it without satisfaction. "But the judge also said the errors weren't provably intentional, so Harrow paid nothing for it, just walked away." "Same surveyor?" Naomi asked. Helen Marsh looked at her with a slight change of expression, the look of someone who has just recalibrated what they're talking to. "Same firm," she said. "Cheyenne firm. Man named Aldridge." "Thank you," Naomi said. "You're welcome." Helen paused. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Something softer," Helen said without apology. "Philadelphia women usually are." Naomi looked at her. "I grew up soft," she said. "It just didn't take." Helen Marsh laughed, genuinely, not politely, and the sound of it moved through the store, and Caleb, who was across the room negotiating the price of coal oil with Otis Pratt, heard it and looked over without meaning to, and what he saw was his wife standing at the dry goods counter with a woman who was laughing, and it was so ordinary and so unexpected that he looked away quickly before either of them noticed. On the ride back, Naomi told him about Aldridge. Caleb drove and listened. The wagon moved over the rutted road, and the sky above the valley was the specific pale gray of late October in Wyoming, which is not a warm color but has its own kind of beauty if you've lived with it long enough to stop fighting it. "If it's the same firm," Naomi said, "then there's a pattern, and a pattern is something a court can look at." Helen Marsh doesn't know it was intentional. "No, but she knows the name of the firm, and I know the firm's name on Harrow's document, and they match. That's worth something in a letter to your lawyer." "You want to write another letter?" "I want you to write another letter," she said. "It should come from you." He glanced at her. "You'd write it better." "Maybe, but it should come from you. The ranch is yours." He looked back at the road. "We could draft it together." She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. The word together sat in the space between them without either of them commenting on it, and the horses moved through the gray afternoon, and the valley spread out around them with all its indifferent beauty. And Caleb thought about the fact that he had been to Otis Pratt's store 43 times without anyone in it laughing, and that this was apparently what it took to change that. The letter went out Friday. By the following Wednesday, something else had happened that changed the shape of everything. It was Elsie who caused it, in the way that small children cause significant things, without intention and without warning, in the gap between one moment and the next. She had been coming down with something for 2 days, the low-grade restlessness and flushed cheeks that precede an illness in children the way clouds precede weather, and Caleb had noticed and not wanted to notice, because illness in children on isolated ranches carried a specific terror that he could not be rational about. Not after Margaret. His wife had started with a fever and been dead in 11 days. And this was not a thing that a person recovered from knowing, even when the logical part of his mind told him that Elsie was 5 years old and strong and this was almost certainly a winter cold, and not the thing that had taken Margaret. The logical part of his mind and the other part of his mind had not always been on good terms since then. On Wednesday night, Elsie's fever came up properly. She woke at 2 in the morning crying, not loudly, not dramatically, the way children cry when they are genuinely frightened rather than performing. And Caleb was out of bed before he was fully awake, and at her door, and found her sitting up with her fist pressed to her chest, the specific gesture she made when something hurt, and she was trying not to show it, and the fever was high enough that her skin was hot under his palm. He stood in her doorway with his heart going at a speed that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of walking down a hallway. "It hurts," Elsie said. Her voice was small. "I know," he said. "I know, sweetheart." He sat on the edge of her bed and pulled her against him, and she came readily, which told him the fever was worse than it looked because Elsie did not do anything readily. He sat there in the dark with his daughter against his chest and tried to remember what you were supposed to do. Cold cloth, water. He knew this. He knew this, and his mind was going sideways in a direction he was trying not to let it go. The door opened. Naomi came in without ceremony, wearing her robe, carrying the lamp from the hallway, and a cloth already dampened. She had heard and assessed and already started moving before she came to the door. She crossed to Elsie's side of the bed, set the lamp on the washstand, and put her hand against Elsie's forehead with the same focused practicality she brought to everything. "Hi," she said, "but not dangerous yet." "How do you know?" The question came out rougher than he intended. "Because she's coherent and her breathing's even." Naomi met his eyes over Elsie's head. "She has a fever, Caleb. Children get fevers. This one is manageable." He recognized dimly that she was saying this to him as much as about Elsie. He recognized it, and it helped, which embarrassed him. "What do we do?" he said. "Cloth on her forehead, water when she can take it. Keep the room warm but not too warm, and stay with her." Naomi handed him the cloth. "You do the cloth. I'll get water." She went and came back. They sat on either side of Elsie's narrow bed through the rest of the night, taking turns with the cloth, getting water into her when she would take it, and Elsie drifted between sleep and half-wakefulness, and at one point, in that floating, unclear state between the two, reached out one hand to each of them and held on. Caleb looked at his daughter's hand in his own, and Naomi's hand in Naomi's, and at Naomi across the small distance of the bed, and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that wouldn't require him to say too much. By morning, the fever had broken. Elsie slept properly, limp and damp and deeply unconscious, the way children sleep when a fever releases them. Naomi was at the window when Caleb looked up, gray dawn light coming through, and her face had the particular exhaustion of a person who has been watching carefully for hours. "She'll be fine," Naomi said, quietly, not performing confidence, just saying what was true. He nodded. There was a long silence. He should have gone to start the stove and let her rest. He sat where he was for another minute, in the chair beside Elsie's bed in the early gray light, and said, "When Margaret got sick, the fever came on fast. 6 days after it started, she didn't know who I was." Naomi said nothing. She was listening. "I was convinced all night it was the same thing," he said. "I know," she said. "You couldn't have known that." "I could see it on your face," she said, not unkindly. "You weren't looking at Elsie. You were looking past her." He looked at the floor. "It wasn't the same thing," she said. "And you didn't fall apart. You stayed and you did what needed doing. That's what she needed from you." He didn't respond to that. He got up and went to start the stove because the house was cold, and someone had to, and because he had said more than he was used to saying and needed the movement. But he thought about what she'd said for the rest of the day in the way you think about something that has corrected a wrong angle you didn't know you were holding. Elsie recovered in 2 days with the unnerving speed of children and emerged from her room on Friday morning fully herself, demanding to know if Thomas the barn cat had been fed while she was sick and whether Naomi would make the bean soup again because it was better than the regular soup. Life resumed. But the resumption had a different quality than before. Something had been established in that nighttime room that neither Caleb nor Naomi named or referred to directly. The distance between them, which had never been hostile but had been real and deliberate on both sides, was simply less. Not gone. Less. He began asking her opinion on things. Not the legal matter, which they discussed practically and regularly, but smaller things, ranch things, the kind of operational decisions that had only ever lived in his own head. She offered opinions without overstating them, which he found he trusted. She asked him things too, gradually, about the land, the cattle, the history of the place, with genuine curiosity, not politeness. He came in from the barn one afternoon to find her at the kitchen table with his original survey map spread out in front of her, and 2 pages of her own notes beside it, cross-referenced in a hand that was small and precise. And she looked up when he came in and said, "The Aldridge firm did at least 4 surveys in this county in the last 3 years. I found a reference to 2 of them in documents you have from the county clerk." He sat down across from her. "Where did you find county clerk documents?" "You had them in the bottom drawer with the land deed. I was looking for the deed." "I don't remember putting them there." "No," she said neutrally, "but they were there." He looked at the notes. She had mapped the overlap of Aldridge surveys against disputed property claims, connecting references from documents he hadn't thought to connect. It was meticulous, and it was clear, and it was the work of someone who had spent more hours on it than the daylight would account for. "You did this last night," he said. "Some of it." "After Elsie was in bed?" "Yes." He looked at her. "Naomi, you don't have to. This is not what you came here to do." She met his eyes. "What did I come here to do?" He opened his mouth, closed it. She was watching him without impatience, just waiting. "I don't know exactly," he said, and it was the most honest thing he had said to her yet. "Neither did I," she said. "I thought I came here to keep house and raise a child and make a practical arrangement work. I still think those things matter." She looked down at the notes briefly, then back at him. "But what I actually came here for, I think I'm still finding that out." She paused. "Same as you." He looked at the table, at the survey notes, at his own hands. "Same as me," he said. They worked on the notes for another hour, side by side at the kitchen table with the lamp burning between them. And the wind came up outside the way it does in Red Hollow when November is getting serious, and neither of them went to bed when they probably should have. And it was the first time since Caleb could remember that being inside the house felt less like waiting out the cold, and more like something worth being in out of it. The letter from the Cheyenne lawyer came on the 2nd Thursday of November. His name was Arthur Dean, and he had been practicing land law in Wyoming for 18 years, and his letter was measured and careful and contained one sentence that mattered above all the others. "The pattern of disputes involving the Aldridge firm which you have described, if substantiated, would constitute grounds for a formal challenge to the survey's admissibility in any property proceeding. I advise you to compile every document you can obtain and to make no further agreements, verbal or written, with the opposing party." Caleb read it at the kitchen table. Naomi read it after him. "He believes us," she said. "He believes the evidence." "Same thing," she said, and there was a quiet satisfaction in it that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. He folded the letter and put it in the drawer with the survey documents and said, "This isn't over." "No," she agreed. "Harrow's not going to take a lawyer's letter and walk away from a water source." "He's not the kind of man who does," she said. Caleb looked at her. "You've known men like him before." It was a statement, not a question, and she received it as such. "The shape is the same," she said. "The specific details change. But the shape, a man who has decided he's owed something and has enough money to make his deciding feel like a fact, yes, I've known the shape." "What happened?" he said. Not prying, asking. She considered. "I left," she said, which is the one thing he couldn't account for in his calculation. He thought about what that meant, and about what it said about the decision that had brought her to Red Hollow, and about what it took for a person to decide that a marriage arrangement with a stranger in Wyoming was a preferable situation to whatever they were leaving. He did not ask about the specifics. It was not his to ask yet. "He'll come back before the month is out," Caleb said, "before we can get Dean out here or get to Cheyenne ourselves." "Probably," she said. "When he does—" Caleb stopped. "I want you to stay inside, if he brings men again." Naomi looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said. "Naomi, he came last time expecting to find you alone and found you weren't," she said. "That mattered. That changed what he said and how he said it. If he comes back and I'm not visible, he recalculates you as alone again. She held his gaze. That's not strategy. That's just giving ground. I'm not willing to put you in front of whatever he decides to escalate to. I'm not asking you to put me anywhere, she said. I'm telling you where I intend to be. The silence between them had something different in it now. Not tension exactly, more like two things of similar weight pushing against each other and finding they are well matched. You are the most difficult woman I have never asked for, he said. It came out differently than he'd intended, less like a complaint and more like something else, something that surprised him as he heard himself say it. She looked at him, and something moved across her face that she didn't quite contain in time. Not amusement, warmer than that. I know, she said, but you'll find I'm also the most useful one. He didn't argue the point. He couldn't, because it was true, and also because he was no longer sure it was only usefulness he was thinking about when he thought about her, which was a realization he moved past quickly and filed in the category of things to examine when the Victor Harrow situation was resolved and he had the available mental space. Which might be never, but a man could hope. Outside, the November wind pushed against the house walls and found no way in, because Naomi had sealed the gaps and the lamp burned steady. And in her room, Elsie was asleep with her fist against her cheek, entirely certain that everything was as it should be. And of the three of them, she was the only one who had been certain of that from the very beginning, and she was, as it would turn out, entirely right. Harrow came back on a Tuesday. Not the end of the month, which is what he had said. 3 weeks earlier than that, which told Caleb something about the state of Harrow's patience, and something else about the state of his confidence, because a man who believes he is winning does not move the deadline. A man who has caught wind of something that worries him does. Caleb was at the south fence again, the same fence where Pete Garvey had delivered the telegram that started all of this, when he saw the dust on the road from the east. Too much dust for one rider. He put down the wire stretcher and watched the cloud resolve into 3 horses, then 4, and felt the cold that came up through his work boots settle somewhere higher than his feet. He was back at the yard before they arrived. He did not run. He walked at a pace that was deliberate and even and covered the ground quickly, and he went past the house without going in and positioned himself between the front porch and the road with his arms at his sides. The riders came into the yard. Harrow was in front. Fowler was to his right. The 2 large hands who had come before were there, and this time there was a 4th man Caleb didn't recognize, younger, narrower, wearing a coat that was too good for ranch work and carrying a document case under his arm, which meant he was another lawyer or something that wanted to look like one. Behind Caleb, the front door opened. He had known it would. He had told himself on the walk back that he was going to ask her to stay inside, and he had known, even as he formed the thought that the conversation they'd had 3 weeks ago had already settled that question, and that asking again would not change her answer, and would also be a waste of the 20 seconds before Harrow's horse reached the fence line. Naomi came to stand beside him. Not behind him. Beside him. A half step to his left, close enough that he could have touched her arm without moving, and she stood the way she stood at everything, straight, still, giving nothing away. Harrow reined in. His eyes went to Naomi and stayed there for a beat longer than necessary, a calculation he made openly, the way men do when they have decided you are not worth the courtesy of disguising it. Then he looked at Caleb. Didn't expect to find you at home, Harrow said. Thought you'd be out working. I saw you coming, Caleb said. Harrow smiled at that. He stepped down from his horse and handed the reins to one of his hands and walked forward with his particular unhurried ease. The younger man with the document case followed. Fowler stayed on his horse, which Caleb noted. Got some new information, Harrow said. Thought it was better to discuss in person. What information? Harrow nodded to the young man who opened his case and produced a document and stepped forward. Caleb took it without looking at Harrow and looked at it. It was a court filing. An application for a temporary injunction against the Rowan Ranch's use of the creek pending resolution of the boundary dispute. Filed 6 days ago in the Cheyenne District Court. Caleb read it once, quickly, and felt the specific cold clarity that comes when something you have been braced for finally arrives. Already filed, he said. Didn't see a point in waiting, Harrow said. Given that your lawyer's been sending letters, figured we'd move it along formally. Dean didn't mention this. It was filed Monday, probably hasn't reached him yet. Harrow looked satisfied in a way he was not working very hard to conceal. Injunction hearing is set for December 14th in Cheyenne. Judge Alderton's docket. He paused. Here's the situation, Caleb. You go to that hearing, you're looking at legal fees, travel, lost time from the ranch in the middle of winter. And even if you contest the survey, the Aldridge firm has filed in Cheyenne before and has a track record the court knows. A track record of fraudulent surveys, Naomi said. Her voice was level. No sharpness, no heat. Just the sentence. Harrow turned to look at her. Something changed in his expression. Not anger, not yet, but the particular attention a man pays when something has been said that he did not budget for. Mrs. Rowan, he said. The Brennan dispute, she said, and the Hooper brothers, same firm, same surveyor. The judge in that case found errors in the Aldridge survey but declined to rule on intent. She looked at him directly. We've been in contact with the Brennans. They had not been in contact with the Brennans. Caleb did not move a muscle. Harrow was quiet for 3 full seconds. That's interesting, he said slowly. He was looking at her the way you look at a hand of cards that has shown you something you weren't expecting. You've been doing some research. We've been doing some research, she said. Both of us. Harrow looked at Caleb. Caleb held his gaze. My offer still stands, Harrow said. Water rights for fair market value. You walk away with cash, keep the ranch, no court date in December. The offer doesn't stand, Caleb said. It never stood. The creek belongs to this property, and I'm not selling what's mine. Harrow's pleasant expression did not break. It was too practiced for that. But it thinned. Something underneath it pushed through. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. For yourself. For your family. The last word landed with a deliberateness that was not incidental. Caleb felt Naomi go still beside him. Not frightened still, focused still, the way a person goes still when they are paying very close attention to exactly what has been said and why. I think you should leave, Caleb said. Harrow looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Naomi. Then back at Caleb. And in that look was the flat assessment of a man who has decided that patience has a limit and he is approaching it. December 14th, Harrow said. I'd get your affairs in order. He walked back to his horse. His men followed. The young lawyer packed up his case with the careful efficiency of someone who is paid to remain expressionless and did not quite manage it. He glanced at Naomi once as he turned, a quick look that said more than he probably intended. They rode out. Caleb and Naomi stood in the yard and watched them go, and when the dust had settled back down on the road, he exhaled slowly through his nose and said, We haven't been in contact with the Brennans. Not yet, she said. He looked at her. But we should be, she said. Today, if possible. Do you know where they are? North Brennan Place is 14 miles up the valley. Can you take me there this week? He thought about the fencing that still needed doing and the cattle that needed checking on the upper pasture before the next cold snap, and the December court date that was now a fixed fact on the calendar rather than a threat. Thursday, he said. I can take you Thursday. She nodded. Then she said, He called you family. What? When he said for yourself, for your family. He was including me in that. She said it without inflection. He expected it to frighten me. Did it? She was quiet for a moment, looking at the road where the dust was still settling. It made me angry, she said, which was, Caleb understood, a different thing entirely. They went to the Brennans on Thursday. The Brennan place was north of Red Hollow, higher up the valley, where the wind had more room to run and the cold came down earlier off the mountain ridgeline. Patrick Brennan was 61, a thick-set Irishman who had come west 20 years ago and put down roots with the particular stubbornness of a man who has decided that moving is something he is done with. His wife Catherine was a small, precise woman with gray hair and eyes that measured things quickly. Caleb explained the situation in the front room of the Brennan house with Naomi beside him and Patrick and Catherine Brennan across the table. And Patrick listened without interrupting, which Caleb had not expected, and then said, Same surveyor. Aldridge firm, Caleb said. Patrick looked at Catherine. Something passed between them that was the specific shorthand of people who have talked about a thing many times. We have our documents, Catherine said. She was already getting up. Every piece of paper from that dispute. I kept them all. She came back with a wooden box, the kind that had once held something else and had been repurposed into a record-keeping box. Letter-sized papers folded neatly, organized by date. She put it on the table and Naomi leaned forward without being asked and began to go through it with Catherine guiding her, and Patrick looked at Caleb with the expression of a man who is deciding how much to say. He came at us for 2 years, Patrick said quietly. Started with the survey, same as you. When that didn't work right off, he started with the water, diverted a tributary up the hill, claimed it was a drainage improvement on his land, dried up part of our east pasture. Can he do that legally? His lawyer said yes. Our lawyer said the question was complicated. Patrick's voice was flat. Cost us $800 and 14 months to establish that our lawyer was right. Caleb sat with that number. $800 was more than the ranch cleared in most years. He came away from it without paying anything, Patrick said. Just walked away. Started looking at the next property. He looked at Caleb. He picked you because you were alone. I know. He thought the new wife would make you more uncertain, Patrick said. More interested in settlement. He thought wrong. Patrick looked across the table to where Naomi and Catherine were working through documents with the focused quiet of two women who have recognized in each other a similar quality of attention. Yes, he said. I can see that. Catherine had found something. She was pointing to a line in a document, and Naomi was reading it and nodding slowly. The elevation notation, Naomi said. That's what our surveyor said, Catherine confirmed. Same error. The reference benchmark they used was 40 feet uphill from the one in the original survey. Makes the boundary appear to shift south. If they used the same wrong benchmark on ours, Naomi said, then the error isn't coincidental. It's a method. That's what our lawyer argued, Catherine said. The judge agreed the method was unreliable, but declined to rule on whether it was deliberately unreliable. Because Aldridge testified it was a measurement mistake, Naomi said. Yes. Did your lawyer challenge Aldridge's other surveys at the time? He didn't know about the Hoopers, Catherine said. We didn't know about the Hoopers until after the ruling. Naomi sat back. She looked at Caleb. 3 properties, she said. Same error on all 3. Same surveyor. That is not a mistake. It's not provable as not a mistake, Caleb said. That's what the court found. The court found it without knowing there were 3 instances, she said. 3 is different from 1. She looked at Catherine. Would you be willing to share these documents with our lawyer in Cheyenne? Patrick and Catherine exchanged the shorthand look again. Patrick, Catherine said. Not a question. A prompt. Yes, Patrick said. On one condition. What condition? Caleb said. You win, Patrick said. You actually win the thing, not just get the injunction dropped. Because Harrow needs to pay for something and I haven't been able to make him, and maybe you can. He looked at Caleb with the directness of a man who has nothing left to lose on this particular topic. Make him pay for it, whatever you can. Caleb thought about the December date and the $800 and the 14 months and the dried-up east pasture. I'll do what I can, he said. That's all I'm asking, Patrick said. They stayed for 2 hours. Catherine fed them bread and salt beef and strong coffee, and when they left, she pressed the entire wooden box of documents into Naomi's arms and said, Bring the box back when you're done. I'll want the papers back. Naomi said she would. They shook hands, which struck Caleb afterward as the right gesture. Not a hug, not a wave, a handshake. 2 women who had just become allies in a practical matter and acknowledged it accordingly. On the drive back, the sky was doing something complicated with clouds and the remaining light, and the road was empty in both directions as far as either of them could see. Naomi had the document box on her lap, and one hand on top of it to keep it from sliding on the ruts. 3 properties, Caleb said. 3 that we know of, she said. There may be more. Dean should search the Cheyenne court records for any Aldridge filing in the last 5 years. That's going to cost. Yes, she said, but less than what it costs to lose. He drove. She looked at the box. Patrick Brennan said Harrow picked you because you were alone, she said. He did. He's not entirely wrong, she said. You were alone. It's harder alone. He glanced at her. The afternoon light was coming at a flat angle across the valley, and it caught the side of her face, and she was looking at the road ahead with an expression that was not the careful, neutral expression he had first seen on the train platform. It was something more open than that, something that had been arriving slowly, the way warmth arrives in a room, gradually, until you look up and realize it's there. I'm not alone now, he said. It was a simple statement. He said it plainly, without decoration, which was the only way he knew how to say things that mattered. Naomi did not look at him, but the hand on top of the document box shifted slightly, and her posture changed by some small degree that he couldn't have described precisely. And she said, "No, you're not." The horses moved on down the road, and behind them the last light went out of the sky, and Red Hollow came up in the distance with its 3 streets and its smoking chimneys. And they came home to the house where Elsie was waiting with Martha Garvey and a series of questions about Thomas the barn cat that needed answering immediately. The letter to Arthur Dean went out Friday with the Brennan documents, and Caleb wrote it himself this time. No drafting, no collaboration, just the facts laid out in the plainest possible order, because plainness was what the situation called for, and he was good at it. Naomi read it before he sealed the envelope and said, "Good," and meant it, and handed it back. What came back from Dean 12 days later was not a letter but a telegram, which meant it was urgent enough that Dean had paid for the wire, which was not a thing lawyers did when the news was comfortable. The telegram said, "Aldridge firm subject to existing complaint in Laramie County. Filed October this year, stop, details follow by letter, stop. Do not agree to any extension or postponement, stop. Come to Cheyenne if possible before December 10th, stop, Dean." Caleb read it at the kitchen table. Naomi read it after him. "Someone else," she said. "Someone else filed against Aldridge in Laramie County," he said, "before us. And Dean didn't know about it when he wrote the first letter. He knows now." They looked at each other across the table. "Someone has to go to Cheyenne," she said. "I know. Before the 10th. That's less than 2 weeks." "I know." He was doing the calculation already, the cost of the trip, the time away from the ranch in December, the cattle that needed tending, Elsie. "I can manage the ranch for 3 days," Naomi said. He looked at her. "I can," she said, not insistently, factually. "Helen Marsh's husband can look in on the cattle. I've met him twice and he offered, and I can handle what needs handling here." "You've never wintered a ranch." "No," she said, "but I know how to follow a list of instructions, and you can write me a very thorough one before you go." I was quiet. He was thinking about the same thing she was probably thinking about, Elsie's fever, and the night they had sat on either side of the narrow bed, and what it meant to leave. "I'll take Elsie to the Garveys," he said. "Elsie doesn't need to go to the Garveys," Naomi said. "She can stay here with me." "That's a lot to manage alone." "Caleb," she said his name with patience, "I have been managing difficult things alone for longer than you've known me. Let me do this." He looked at her. "All right," he said. He left on the 8th, on the early Tuesday train. Elsie took this with the seriousness she brought to things she had decided to be brave about, which meant she held his hand at the station and did not cry, but pressed her mouth into a line that was a considerable effort. He crouched down to her level and told her he'd be back by Friday at the latest, and she said, "I know," in the tone of someone who does not entirely know, but has decided to act as though they do. Then she turned to Naomi and said, "You'll be here." "Yes," Naomi said. "Promise?" "Yes," Naomi said, without hesitation. Elsie nodded, as though this had been the crucial piece of information, and released Caleb's hand. He looked at Naomi over his daughter's head. There was something in that moment. The 3 of them on the train platform in the cold morning, the place where this had started, the same platform where Naomi had stepped down with her single large bag and her careful neutrality, that had the quality of a door fully open. Not the latch releasing, the door open. He did not know what to do with that on a train platform with 4 minutes before departure. "The letter from Dean will probably come while I'm there," he said. "I'll hold it. Don't open it." "I wasn't going to open it." "I know." He paused. "I know you weren't." He picked up his bag. He started for the train. "Caleb," she said. He turned. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Come back with something we can use." "That's the plan," he said. He got on the train. Bob. Cheyenne in December was a different animal from Red Hollow. Larger, louder, operating at a scale that reminded Caleb why he had never wanted to live in a city. The streets were busy and the buildings pressed close, and the cold came off the plains with nothing to slow it down. He found Dean's office on the second floor of a building on Ferguson Street. Arthur Dean was a thin, organized man of 50 who had the manner of someone who has seen enough frontier property disputes to have lost any remaining capacity for surprise. He shook Caleb's hand and got directly to it, which Caleb appreciated. County complaint, Dean said, spreading documents across his desk. Filed in October by a man named Samuel Voss. Water rights dispute. Aldridge survey. Same benchmark error. 4 properties, Caleb said. 4 that have filed. There may be others who settled. Dean looked at him over his glasses. Voss's lawyer is a man named Grath. He's been building a case against the Aldridge firm specifically, not just against the individual survey, but against the firm's practice. Surveyor fraud, if he can prove deliberate misapplication. Can he prove it? With 4 instances using an identical methodological error? Dean settled back. He can make a compelling argument. A judge who is paying attention will see it. He paused. I've reached out to Grath. He wants to talk to you. When? Tomorrow morning. Grath's office was across town. He was a shorter man, broader, with the kind of energy that comes from someone who is personally invested in his cases in a way that is professionally inadvisable and practically very effective. He shook Caleb's hand with both of his. You've got the Brennan documents, he said immediately. My wife gathered them, Caleb said. She identified the benchmark discrepancy. Grath looked at him. Your wife? She came from Philadelphia. She has a very good eye for inconsistency. Grath appeared to reassess something. I need copies of everything, he said. I need them before your December 14th hearing. You'll have them. And I need an affidavit from the Brennans confirming the survey dispute and the outcome. I'll write to them today. Grath spread his own documents across the table, and they worked for 3 hours, cross-referencing every Aldridge filing they could locate against the pattern of benchmark errors. By the end of the 3rd hour, they had 6 properties, not 4, 6, with the same methodological signature spanning 5 years and 2 counties. 6 is not a mistake, Grath said. No, Caleb said. 6 is a business model. Caleb thought about Victor Harrow in his good suit with his pleasant smile, dropping a document on a fence post and whistling as he walked away. He thought about Patrick Brennan's $800 and his dried-up East pasture. He thought about the Hooper brothers, who had both settled early and said nothing publicly. Can we get this in front of Alderton on the 14th, he said. Not all of it, but enough to challenge the survey's admissibility. If Alderton kicks the survey, Harrow has no case. And if he doesn't kick it, then we go back to the property line argument, which is weaker but not lost. Grath looked at him. The Brennan documents are what changes this. Your wife finding that benchmark correlation. That's what makes 6 instances look like a pattern instead of 6 bad surveys. Caleb thought about Naomi at the kitchen table with the lamp burning, working on survey maps at midnight while he was asleep. He thought about her on the porch when Harrow came the 2nd time, saying the elevation notation doesn't match in a voice that had no performance in it anywhere. She'll be glad to hear it, he said. Bring her to the hearing, Grath said. She's managing the ranch. Find a way, Grath said. A judge sees a man alone, he sees a property dispute. He sees a man with his family, he sees what Harrow is actually trying to take. He paused. I'm not saying it should work that way. I'm saying it does. Caleb sat with that for a moment. I'll see what I can arrange, he said. He came back to Red Hollow on Friday, as promised. The train pulled in at 2:30, and Naomi was at the station, which he had not expected. She had Elsie beside her and the wagon behind her, and she was wearing her good coat against the cold, and when he stepped down from the train, Elsie let go of Naomi's hand and ran the last 12 feet with total disregard for the dignity of the platform. He caught her and picked her up, and she said, Thomas caught something in the barn, in the tone of someone who has been waiting to deliver news and finally has the opportunity. Did he? Caleb said. A very large mouse. Naomi let me watch. Did she? She said it was nature, Elsie said gravely, and that nature is sometimes unpleasant but important. He looked at Naomi over Elsie's head. She was watching him with the expression that was not quite a smile, which he was beginning to be able to read as what it actually was. A smile that she had decided not to put fully on the outside yet, for reasons of her own. How was the ranch? He said. Intact, she said. Dean's letter came. I held it. Good. Tom Marsh came twice to check the cattle. One fence post on the north side came loose. I had Pete Garvey's older brother fix it for 30 cents. That's a fair price. I thought so. She took Elsie from him and set her down. How was Cheyenne? He picked up his bag. Come home, he said. I'll tell you everything. They walked to the wagon. Elsie went between them, one hand in each of theirs, holding on with the total commitment of a child who has decided this is where her hands belong. And the cold afternoon settled around Red Hollow with its 3 streets and its smoking chimneys. And Caleb looked at the town he had lived in for 11 years and felt, for the first time in longer than he could account for, that he was arriving somewhere rather than just returning. That night, after Elsie was asleep, they sat at the kitchen table with Dean's letter and Caleb's notes from Cheyenne spread between them, and he told her everything: Grath, the 6 properties, the benchmark pattern, the December 14th hearing. She listened without interrupting, which was the way she listened to everything that mattered. When he finished, she said, 6. 6, he confirmed. He's been doing this for 5 years. At least. She looked at the table, at the survey maps she had memorized, at the letter from Dean. Then she said, Grath wants us at the hearing. He didn't say us. He said family, she said. Which is us. The word landed the same way it had when it was in Harrow's mouth, but differently, entirely differently, the way the same note sounds different depending on the instrument. Can you arrange it? Caleb said. Not a question exactly, more like an opening. Helen Marsh will take Elsie, Naomi said. She offered last week, and I can be ready to travel by the 12th if we leave Tuesday. She had already been calculating. She had already been thinking about it. He had said we, and she had heard it the same way he'd meant it. Tuesday, he said. Tuesday, she confirmed. He looked at her across the kitchen table, in the lamplight, with the survey papers between them and the cold pressing at the sealed walls of the house, and he thought about a telegram that had arrived on an ordinary Tuesday and changed the shape of everything, and about a woman who had stepped off a train and stood in the doorframe of a porch and said, I intend to make that worth something, and had made good on the intention in ways neither of them had imagined yet, and some that were still arriving. Naomi, he said. She looked up. He did not have the words precisely organized. He was a man who worked better with practical things, fence lines, cattle counts, plainly stated facts. But there were things that did not belong to the category of practical, and they had been accumulating in him for weeks without a category to live in, and sitting across from her in that kitchen at the end of that particular day, he ran out of room for them in the uncategorized drawer. Thank you, he said, for all of it. The documents, the Brennans, staying here when I was gone. He paused. For being on that porch when Harrow came. She looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was open in a way he had not seen it be from the beginning, from that first day on the platform. The careful neutrality was not there, had not been there for some time, and what was there instead was something that had been coming slowly and had arrived. You don't need to thank me, she said. It's my ranch too. It was simply said, without drama or claim-making, just a fact she was stating. He nodded. Because it was true. Because it had been true for longer than either of them had said it out loud, and saying it made the truth more solid, the way things become more solid when they are spoken, the way a house becomes more fully itself when it has people in it who intend to stay. Outside, November had given up entirely, and December had moved in with conviction, and the wind came down hard off the mountain and found no way into the house, because the walls were sealed and the lamp was burning, and 2 people who had not chosen each other were sitting across a kitchen table and choosing each other now, in the particular unhurried way that people choose things when they mean to keep them. They left for Cheyenne on Tuesday morning before the sun was properly up. Helen Marsh had come the evening before to collect Elsie, arriving with her coat buttoned to the chin and a tin of oatmeal cookies that she pressed into Elsie's hands with the manner of a woman who understands that transitions go better with something concrete to hold. Elsie had accepted the cookies with solemnity and then turned to Naomi and said, You'll come back, which was not a question. Yes, Naomi said, with Papa. With your father, yes. Elsie looked at her for a moment with those eyes that were too old for her face, doing whatever calculation she did privately, and then nodded and took Helen Marsh's hand and went without further ceremony, which was, Caleb knew, not indifference, but the particular trust of a child who has decided that the people she depends on will do what they say. It was a heavier thing to carry than crying would have been. The road to the train station was frozen solid, and the wagon moved over it with a jarring steadiness that made conversation difficult, which suited Caleb well enough because he had been turning things over in his mind since the previous night and hadn't arrived anywhere useful yet. He was thinking about the courtroom, about Grath's organized energy and Dean's careful precision, and whether 6 instances of the same benchmark error in the hands of 2 lawyers was enough to move a judge who had seen Aldridge testify before and found him credible. He was thinking about Harrow, who would also be in that courtroom, with Fowler and the young lawyer with the document case, and whatever additional preparation they had done in the weeks since the injunction filing. He was also thinking about what Naomi had said the night before at the kitchen table. "It's my ranch, too," and how simply she had said it, and what it meant that she had said it, and what it meant that he had received it without correction or qualification. Naomi sat beside him on the wagon seat with the document box on her lap, wearing her good coat and her Philadelphia hat, which she had worn on the day she arrived and had not worn since. It was not a practical hat for ranch life, too good and too distinctive for daily work, but for Cheyenne it was the right hat. He noticed it and said nothing about it, but he noticed it. "You're thinking about the judge," she said, without looking at him. "Among other things." "Alderton heard the Brennan dispute," she said. "He ruled on incomplete information. If Grath presents the full pattern, 6 properties, 5 years, the same methodological signature, Alderton has the opportunity to correct an earlier ruling. Judges don't always take that opportunity, but the good ones do." "You don't know if Alderton's a good one." "No," she said, "but the fact that he ruled against Harrow even on incomplete evidence suggests he's at least a careful one." He looked at the road. "That's optimistic." "It's logical," she said. "Optimism is when you assume the outcome will be good. Logic is when you assess the factors and determine the outcome is possible. I try to stay on the logic side." He glanced at her. "Do you always manage that?" She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "Not always." He drove. The dawn was coming up gray and thin over the eastern ridgeline, the particular gray of Wyoming December that most people from elsewhere found depressing, and that Caleb had long since made his peace with. It was honest, that gray. It didn't pretend to be something warmer than it was. "I'm not optimistic," he said, "but I'm not ready to concede either." "Good," she said. "Neither am I." They caught the 7 o'clock train south. The courtroom in Cheyenne was larger than anything in Red Hollow, with high ceilings and wood paneling that had been polished enough times to suggest a place that took itself seriously. It smelled like wood oil and coal smoke and the accumulated proceedings of men arguing about property and money and who was owed what by whom. Caleb had been in it once before, years ago, for a minor matter about a road easement that had resolved before it reached trial. The room had felt neutral then. It did not feel neutral now. Grath met them in the hallway outside at 9 in the morning, 2 hours before the hearing. He shook Caleb's hand and then Naomi's, and looked at the document box she was carrying with an expression of undisguised relief. "The Brennan affidavit came," he said. "Patrick Brennan signed it and his wife signed it, and they had it witnessed by the Red Hollow postmaster." "Otis Pratt," Caleb said. "Yes, it arrived yesterday." Grath turned and led them down the hallway to a small room with a table. "Sit down. We have 2 hours, and I want to go through everything." They went through everything. Grath's case was built in 3 layers. The first was the original survey record, the 1871 document that established the Rowan property line, which was clear and unambiguous and had been unchallenged for 13 years. The second was the Aldridge survey submitted by Harrow, with the benchmark discrepancy Naomi had identified, laid against the Brennan documents and the Hooper records and the Voss filing in Laramie County, and 2 additional properties Grath had located in the week since Caleb's visit, making the total count 8. 8 surveys, 8 instances of the same error, 5 years, 1 firm. The third layer was the most dangerous, because it required the judge to take a step that courts were traditionally reluctant to take. From this survey is unreliable to this survey was deliberately falsified for the benefit of a specific party. Grath did not argue this directly. He argued it by implication, which was more durable in a courtroom. He intended to show that the Aldridge firm had a working relationship with Harrow that predated every survey dispute, documented through land transaction records Dean had pulled from the county clerk's office in 2 counties. "You're saying Harrow commissioned the errors," Caleb said. I'm saying the pattern of errors follows the pattern of Harrow's land acquisition interests, Grath said. I'm letting the judge say the rest. Will Alderton say the rest? He said some of it in the Brennan ruling. Grath looked at his documents. He declined to rule on intent because he had one instance. 8 instances is a different argument. Naomi had been reading through the affidavit while they talked. She looked up. Fowler is Harrow's lawyer today? Fowler and a man named Crane from Denver, Grath said. Crane is the reason they've been delaying. He's more experienced than Fowler. Better than Fowler. Significantly. Grath said it without alarm, the way a doctor says a diagnosis. This is what we're dealing with, now let's deal with it. Crane will argue that 8 instances of a shared methodological approach are evidence of a consistent surveying practice, not fraud. He'll argue that Aldridge uses this benchmark reference as his standard, and that the discrepancy with the original surveys is a question of which measurement approach the court chooses to credit, not a question of falsification. And how do you counter that? Naomi said. I put the original Rowan survey on record with an expert witness who establishes that the benchmark used in 1871 was the standard for the region and decade, and that any professional surveyor operating in the same region would know this and would know that using a different benchmark without disclosing the change would produce a misleading result. Grath paused. Then I put all 8 properties on a map and show the judge that the misleading result, in every single case, moves the property line in a direction that benefits Harrow. The room was quiet for a moment. 8 for 8, Naomi said. 8 for 8, Grath confirmed. A coin comes up the same side 8 times in a row, even a fair-minded man starts to wonder about the coin. Caleb looked at the map Grath unrolled across the table. 8 properties, 8 shifted boundary lines, all of them moving, on paper, toward the man sitting on the other side of the courtroom with his pleasant expression and his Denver lawyer. What do you need from us? Caleb said. From you. Your testimony on the timeline. When Harrow first approached you, what he said, what he offered. Keep it factual. Dates, words, actions. Don't characterize his intent. Let the pattern do that. And from me, Naomi said. Grath looked at her directly. You identified the benchmark discrepancy. I may need you to explain it to the judge in plain language. Not legal language, not technical language. The way you'd explain it to a neighbor. I can do that? You'll be challenged by Crane. He'll try to establish that you have no formal surveying background and therefore your analysis is lay opinion without evidentiary weight. He'd be right that I have no formal background, she said. Yes, but he'd be wrong that it matters, because the discrepancy is visible in the documents themselves and anyone with working literacy can see it once it's pointed out. The expert witness establishes the professional standard. You establish that the departure from that standard is visible to a non-expert reading the documents side by side. Grath looked at her. That's actually a stronger position than expert testimony in some respects. It says the error is not subtle. Naomi nodded. One more thing, Grath said. He looked at both of them. Harrow will be in that room. He will look comfortable. He has money and he has a Denver lawyer and he has operated in this county for 20 years without meaningful consequence. Do not let that shake you. The composure of a man who has gotten away with things is not the same as the composure of a man who is innocent. Caleb looked at the map with its 8 shifted boundary lines. I know the difference, he said. The hearing began at 11. Judge Alderton was 60, with white hair and a face that gave nothing away at all, which Caleb found neither encouraging nor discouraging because it was what a judge's face was supposed to do. He came in without ceremony and sat and looked at the courtroom with the flat attention of a man who has seen every version of this kind of dispute and is prepared to hear this one without assumptions. Harrow was at the opposing table with Fowler and a man Caleb assumed was Crane, broad-shouldered, well-dressed, with the particular stillness of a man who is very good at waiting. Harrow looked at Caleb when he came in, and his expression did what it always did, arranged itself into something pleasant, and then his eyes moved to Naomi, and the pleasantness acquired an edge that he didn't quite conceal. Naomi sat down beside Caleb at the table and opened her folder of documents, and did not look at Harrow at all. Grath opened with the original survey and the chain of title. He was methodical and clear, and took 40 minutes to establish a foundation that Crane attempted twice to interrupt, and Alderton sustained through both interruptions, which was information. Crane's opening argument was as Grath had predicted: consistent surveying practice, methodological choice, The question of which benchmark the court chose to credit is standard. He was smooth and authoritative and spoke with the confidence of a man who has won similar arguments before, which he probably had. Then Grath put the map on the table. 8 properties, 8 boundary shifts, all in the same direction, all benefiting the same party. The courtroom was quiet in a way that had texture to it, not the quiet of disinterest, the quiet of people looking at something and understanding what they're looking at. Alderton looked at the map for a long time. "Counselor," he said to Crane, "your client's name appears in connection with how many of these properties?" Crane said, "Your Honor, the properties on that map represent separate disputes with separate—" "I asked how many," Alderton said. A pause. 6 of the 8 involve property adjacent to or near my client's holdings," Crane said, "and the surveys showing the boundary adjustments in question were all conducted by the same firm. The Aldridge firm has an extensive practice in this region. Counselor." Alderton's voice had not changed in volume or temperature, but something in it had become less negotiable. "I want you to answer my question and then stop talking. How many of these 8 surveys were conducted by the Aldridge firm?" "All 8, Crane said. Alderton looked at the map again. Then he said, "We'll recess for 20 minutes. Look." During the recess, Caleb and Naomi stood in the hallway with Grath, who was carefully not showing what he was thinking. "He's going to kick it," Naomi said quietly. "Possibly," Grath said. He recognized the pattern. He recognized something. The recess could mean he's reading the Aldridge file, or it could mean he's composing his ruling, or it could mean he needed to use the facilities. Grath looked at them both. "Don't count anything yet." Caleb was watching the door to the courtroom across the hall. Harrow and Crane had gone back inside. Fowler was in the hallway 20 feet away, looking at his shoes with the expression of a man revising his estimates. "Fowler doesn't look comfortable," Caleb said. Grath glanced at Fowler. "Fowler has been in Red Hollow long enough to know what the pattern on that map means for Victor Harrow's standing in this county," he said quietly. "I suspect Fowler is calculating how close his own name sits to what's on that map." Naomi said, "Does Crane know about the complaint in Laramie County?" "He knows," Grath said. "It's in the filing record. He's been hoping Alderton wouldn't connect it to this case." "The map connected it," she said. "The map connected it," Grath agreed. The 20 minutes were closer to 35. When they went back in, Alderton was already at the bench, and his face was the same flat, giving nothing away face it had been all morning, and Caleb sat down and felt the particular kind of still that comes when a thing you cannot control is about to happen, and all your energy goes into not showing that you feel it. Naomi's hand was on the table beside his, not touching his hand, close to it. He did not know if the proximity was intentional or incidental. He decided not to determine which. Alderton spoke for 11 minutes. He ruled that the Aldridge survey submitted by the plaintiff was inadmissible as evidence of the property boundary for the purposes of the injunction on the grounds that the methodological approach used in the survey departed without disclosure from the established regional standard in use at the time of the original property filing, producing a result that could not be independently verified against the original markers. He further ruled that the injunction application was denied. He further ruled, and this was the sentence that Grath had told them was possible and had told them not to count on, that given the pattern of survey work conducted by the Aldridge firm across multiple properties, he was referring the matter to the Territorial Attorney General's office for investigation of potential systematic fraud. Referral. Not ruling, not judgment, but referral, which meant a record, which meant Harrow's 5 years of carefully accumulated strategic surveys were now the subject of a formal investigation with the weight of the territory behind it. The courtroom did not make noise after rulings. It was not that kind of room. But there was a shift in the air, the specific shift that happens when something has been decided and everyone in the room knows it. Caleb exhaled. He had not known he was holding his breath until he released it. Beside him, Naomi's hand closed on his. He turned and looked at her. Her expression was not triumphant. It was not the face of someone who has won. It was the face of someone who has been holding something very tightly for a long time and has just been told they can let go. Her eyes were bright in a way they had not been before, and she was looking at him with everything she had been careful about for 2 months fully present in her face, undisguised, because there was nothing left to be careful about. He turned his hand over under hers and held on. They sat like that in the courtroom while Alderton said the formal words that closed the session, while Crane leaned close to Harrow and spoke quietly in his ear, and Harrow's pleasant expression finally, completely, went somewhere else and did not come back. Outside, on the steps of the building in the cold December air, Grath shook both their hands and said it wasn't finished. The Attorney General investigation was separate from the property question, and the property question would likely need a follow-up proceeding to formally confirm the original boundary, and there were costs still coming that he wanted them to be prepared for. Caleb said he understood. Grath said the referral was more than he had expected from Alderton, and that what had made the difference was the map with the 8 properties, and that the map had been possible because of the Brennan documents, and that the Brennan documents had been identified as relevant because of the benchmark analysis that Naomi had done at a kitchen table in Red Hollow at midnight. He said this looking at Naomi. She said, "Thank you for making use of it." "Thank you for finding it," Grath said, and he meant it simply, without ceremony, the way useful things are acknowledged between practical people. He went back inside. Dean shook hands and followed. Caleb and Naomi stood on the steps with the cold coming across the plaza from the north and the city moving around them in its indifferent way. And Cheyenne was not Red Hollow, and the sky above it was the same Wyoming December sky, but from a different angle, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Naomi said, "We need to wire Patrick Brennan." He almost laughed. He did not quite laugh, but it was closer to it than he had been in longer than he could remember. "Yes," he said, "we do. He asked us to make Harrow pay for something. The Attorney General referral isn't payment yet." "No," she said, "but it's the beginning of it." She looked at him. "That'll have to do for now?" They sent the wire from the telegraph office on Ferguson Street, addressed to Patrick Brennan, Red Hollow, Wyoming, and it said, "Injunction denied stop survey, ruled inadmissible, stop Attorney General, referral, filed, stop. Alderton, stop, more to follow, stop. Caleb and Naomi Rowan. Caleb and Naomi Rowan." He had dictated it that way without thinking about it, and the telegraph operator had written it down, and it was sent before it occurred to him that he had said it as though it were the most natural sentence in the world, which it was, which was the thing he had been slowly arriving at without naming. They had a night in Cheyenne before the morning train north. Dean had recommended a boarding house on Capitol Avenue run by a woman named Mrs. Falconer, who kept clean rooms and a decent table and did not ask questions, which was all that was required. The rooms were side by side, separated by a wall that was thinner than the walls in the ranch house, and the sounds of Cheyenne came through the window. A city sound, different from what either of them was used to in different ways. Naomi was at the small desk in her room when Caleb knocked on the door between their rooms. She called for him to come in. She had the survey documents out again. He almost said something about it, about the fact that the hearing was over, the documents had done their work, she could stop. But he understood, looking at her, that it was not about the documents anymore. It was about having something to do with her hands while she thought, which was how she processed things. And the thing she was processing was not the hearing. He sat down in the chair by the window. "Grath is going to need us again," she said, "for the follow-up proceeding." "Probably spring," he said. "We should plan for it." "Yes." She made a note. Then she put down the pen and turned to look at him, and the careful quality she had carried from the beginning, the deliberateness, the watching, was present but differently arranged than it usually was, less protective of something and more open to it. "You said Naomi Rowan at the telegraph office," she said. "Yes." "You didn't think about it." "No," he said. "I didn't." She looked at him. "Is that how you think of it?" she said. "Us." He looked at her directly, because this was the kind of question that deserved to be looked at directly. "I've been thinking about how I think of it for a while," he said. "I haven't been in a hurry to name it because I didn't want to say something before I was sure of it. And now? Now I said Naomi Rowan to a telegraph operator without thinking about it," he said, "which suggests I'm more sure of it than I realized." She was quiet for a moment. "Caleb," she said, "I came here to make a practical arrangement work. I want you to know that I know the difference between what I came here for and what this has become. And I'm not asking you to be certain about something you're not certain about. I know what you lost. I know that doesn't go away." "No," he said, "it doesn't. So take whatever time, Naomi." She stopped. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, which was the posture of a man who is about to say something he has organized carefully. I'm going to say this once, and I'd like you to listen to all of it before you respond. She nodded. What I lost is real, and I don't pretend it isn't. Margaret was my wife for 7 years and she died, and I wasn't done with loving her when she went, and I will probably carry some part of that for the rest of my life. That's not something I can promise you won't exist. I can't promise that. He stopped. What I can tell you is that what I feel when I sit across from you at that table, and what I feel when you're on that porch and Harrow is in the yard, and what I feel when I came back from Cheyenne the first time and you were at the station with Elsie, that's not something I'm managing or making room for or being careful about. It's just true. It was true before I knew it was true, and knowing it is true is not frightening, which is how I know it's real. He stopped. The room was quiet. That's all, he said. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. Her expression had moved completely past the careful neutral that had been her baseline when she stepped off the train, and what was underneath it was something he had been catching glimpses of for weeks. Something that had the quality of a person who has been waiting to find out if a thing was safe to want, and has just been told that it is. I'm not asking you to replace her, she said. Her voice was even. I wouldn't. She was here first, and she's Elsie's mother, and she's part of this land. I'm not interested in erasing that. I know, he said. I'm asking something different from that, she said. I'm asking if there's room for what this is, whatever it is, alongside all of that. Yes, he said, without pause. She let out a slow breath, and the last of the careful, held-back quality went out of her, and she said, All right, he said. It was not a romantic scene. There was no declaration that swept everything clean, no moment where the past dissolved and the future arrived in a rush of feeling. It was two people in a modest room in Cheyenne, in December, with survey maps on the desk and the sounds of a city coming through the window, deciding to stop managing the distance between them and find out what was on the other side of it. She reached across and put her hand against his face, briefly, with a kind of directness that was entirely her, and he put his hand over hers, and they sat like that for a moment. Then she said, You should sleep. The train's early. He said, You should put the surveys away. She looked at the desk. In a minute. You've been looking at them for 2 months. In a minute, she said again, but she was almost smiling when she said it. I went back to his room. He lay in the boarding house bed and listened to the city and to the sound of papers being organized on the other side of the thin wall, and then the sound of a lamp being lowered, and then quiet. He slept better than he had in longer than he could account for. They came back to Red Hollow on the Friday morning train. The valley in December was stripped down to its essential self. The grass gone to brown, the cottonwoods bare, the creek running dark and quiet through the south pasture, exactly where it was supposed to be, exactly where it had always been. The ranch came into view as they turned off the main road, and Caleb felt the particular thing he felt every time he saw it from the road. A bone-level recognition, the thing you feel about a place that has absorbed enough of your life to be part of your body. He felt it differently today. Not less. More entirely. Helen Marsh brought Elsie back that afternoon. Elsie came through the door at a run and went to Caleb first, which was usual, and then turned to Naomi with an expression that was assessing something. Did you win? She asked. Yes, Naomi said. Did Papa win too? We won together, Naomi said. Elsie thought about this with great seriousness, and then came and put her arms around Naomi's waist, which was as high as she could reach, and Naomi's hand came down on her hair, and the three of them were in the kitchen of the house that had once been in the slow decline of a place that has lost its center in the late afternoon light of a December Friday, and the center had been restored, and it was not the same center as before, because nothing is ever the same after loss. But it was real, and it was functioning, and it was enough and more than enough. Helen Marsh, who had watched all of this from the doorway, said, I'll see myself out, and did. That evening, after Elsie was in bed with her fist against her cheek, and her brown hair spread across the pillow, Caleb came down to the kitchen and found Naomi at the table. Not with surveys this time, but with a cup of coffee and nothing else. Just sitting in the lamplight of the kitchen, she had changed from a place of bare function into something that felt inhabited. He sat down across from her. They didn't talk about Harrow or Grath or the spring proceeding. They didn't talk about anything that required organizing. They drank their coffee in the quiet of the house, with the creek out there in the dark doing what it had always done and would go on doing, and the cold pressed against the sealed walls and found no way in, and the lamp burned steady between them. Caleb looked at the woman across from him. This woman he had not chosen and had not expected, and would have sent back if a 5-year-old girl had not taken her hand on a porch and changed the outcome of that calculation, and thought about the telegram he had sent from Cheyenne, and about how the name had come out before he'd thought about it, and about how the truest things are often the ones that arrive before you're ready for them. "I've been thinking," he said. She looked up. "About the arrangement," he said. "The way it was set up. Agency arrangement, paper marriage, practical purpose." She waited. "I'd like it to be something else," he said. "Not a paper arrangement, not practical purpose." He looked at her. "I'd like to ask you plainly if you're willing to be my wife. Not because the agency sent you, and not because the ranch needed someone, and not because Elsie needed a woman in the house, though all of those things are true, but because I want you here, specifically you, and because what's happened in the last 2 months is something I'd like to keep happening for the rest of my life." He stopped. He had organized it carefully and had said it plainly, which was the best he could do. Naomi looked at him with her coffee cup in both hands and her expression fully open, and she said, "You're asking me to marry you." "I'm asking you to decide to stay married to me," he said. "There's a difference." "There is," she agreed. "The first one was the agency's decision," he said. "This one is yours." She was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that he heard the fire shift in the stove and the wind move past the window, and somewhere outside an animal in the barn settle into a different position. "I'm not going to promise you I'll be easy to live with," she said. "I know what I'm like." "I know what you're like too," he said. "I'm not asking for easy. I'm not going to be a replacement for what you lost. I know that. I'm going to have opinions about things," she said. "The ranch, the finances, what we do about Harrow in the spring. I'm going to read the documents and have opinions." "I'm counting on it," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then something in her face shifted into an expression he had not seen before. Not the almost smile, not the focused stillness, but something warmer and more unguarded than either of those. Something she had been keeping back and had decided now to stop keeping back. "Yes," she said. "I'm willing." He reached across the table and took her hand, which he had done once before in a courtroom in Cheyenne and had not done since, and held it. Outside, the creek ran on through the dark of the December valley, exactly where it was supposed to be. Inside, the lamp burned between two people who had come to each other sideways and uncertain and had arrived, without quite planning to, exactly where they were supposed to be. The winter that followed the Cheyenne hearing was the longest and the quietest Caleb had spent on the ranch in 11 years, and it was the first one in 2 years that did not feel like something to endure. The Attorney General's office sent a letter in January confirming receipt of Alderton's referral and requesting copies of all survey documents related to the Aldridge firm's work in the county. Grath handled the response. Dean coordinated the filing. Caleb and Naomi packaged the documents at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening, organized by date and property, and sent them south on the Tuesday train, and then there was nothing to do but wait, which the frontier in January is very good at teaching you to do. The waiting had a different quality than it had before. Before, waiting had been the space between problems. A held breath. A man alone with a 5-year-old, and a ranch, and a silence that had no good company in it. Now waiting was just time, and time had things in it, meals, conversations that started about practical matters and went somewhere else before they ended. Elsie's ongoing reports on Thomas the Barncat's activities, which were extensive and delivered with the seriousness of a naturalist filing field notes. The way the house felt in the evenings with the lamp burning and the stove going and 3 people occupying it with the settled ease of people who have decided they belong to the same place. Caleb was not a man who examined his own happiness. He was too practical for that, and too familiar with how quickly things changed. But he was aware, in the specific way of someone who has known the absence of a thing, that the house no longer felt like a place where someone used to live. It felt like a place where people were living now, which is not the same thing, and the distance between them is not small. Naomi, for her part, had settled into the ranch with the thoroughness of a person who had decided to understand it rather than just inhabit it. She asked questions about the cattle, the grazing rotation, what Caleb's father had planted and why, what the south pasture looked like in spring when the creek ran full. She walked the property line on a clear January morning with Caleb, both of them in their heaviest coats, while he showed her the original survey markers, the iron stakes that had been driven into the frozen ground in 1871 and had stayed where they were put, indifferent to Harrow's ambitions and Aldridge's arithmetic. She stood at the south marker and looked at the creek and then at the Harrow land on the other side of it, and said, "He must have wanted this very much." The water. "The idea of taking it," she said. "Men like him. It's not always about what the thing is worth. It's about the taking. The evidence that they can." Caleb looked at the creek. It was running slow under a skin of ice at the edges, dark water moving between frozen banks. "My father put in the water rights before he built the house," he said. "Said the water mattered more than the shelter because you can sleep outside but you can't run cattle without water." He was right. He usually was. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I used to think I'd let him down. After Margaret. The way the place was going." Naomi looked at him. "It wasn't going anywhere permanent," he said. "But it was going somewhere I didn't intend, and I knew it, and couldn't seem to change the direction." He looked at the marker in the frozen ground. "I think he'd have had something to say about that." "What would he have said?" Caleb thought about it. "Probably something short," he said. "He wasn't a long speech kind of man. Probably something like, 'The land doesn't care about your grief. Tend it anyway.'" Naomi looked at the creek and the marker and the Harrow land beyond it, and then at Caleb. "He sounds like someone I'd have liked," she said. "You'd have argued with each other," Caleb said. "Probably," she agreed. "That doesn't mean I wouldn't have liked him." They walked back along the fence line with the cold coming down off the mountain, and the ranch spread out around them in its winter undress. Brown and gray and white, honest about what it was, not trying to be anything else. And Caleb thought about his father's saying, about tending the land anyway, and thought that the principle probably extended past land, past cattle, past fence lines and water rights, into all the things a person is responsible for keeping alive, even when keeping them alive is harder than the grief would prefer. The letter from the Attorney General's office came in March. It was longer than the previous letter and denser, written in the language of official proceedings, and Caleb read it once standing at the kitchen table and then put it down and said, "I need to read this again." He read it again. The Territorial Attorney General had reviewed the Aldridge firm's survey work across a 6-county area and had identified 14 properties, not 8, 14, with the identical benchmark error. Of those 14, 11 involved parcels adjacent to Victor Harrow's landholdings. The Aldridge firm's principal surveyor had been subpoenaed and had, in his testimony, acknowledged that a modified benchmark reference had been used in certain surveys at the specific written request of a client, the name of whom he had provided to the Attorney General under conditions of cooperation. The name was Victor Harrow. Caleb read that sentence 3 times. Naomi was at the stove. She had been watching him read without asking, because she had learned his reading face by now and could tell the difference between reading that was absorbing information and reading that was absorbing something significant. She could see it was significant. "Read the 3rd paragraph from the bottom," he said. She came to the table and read it. She read it once, then straightened up and stood very still for a moment with her hands flat on the table. "He named him," she said. "Under cooperation conditions," Caleb said, "which means Aldridge told them everything in exchange for reduced penalty." "What does that mean for Harrow?" "Grath needs to explain what it means legally, what it means practically." He stopped. "I thought about Patrick Brennan and his $800 and his dried east pasture and the 2 years of pressure before the ruling that had cost him most of a season's profit. He thought about the Hoopers, who had settled and said nothing and were still living next to a man who had stolen from them and gotten away with it. "It means he can't do it again," Naomi said. "Whatever the legal consequence, he can't do it again because everyone knows now." "Everyone will know," Caleb said, "when this becomes public record." "In a county this size," she said, "that's the same thing." Caleb sent a wire to Grath that afternoon. Grath's response came back the next morning and said, in his characteristic telegraphic efficiency, "Attorney General filing constitutes formal fraud. Finding stop. Harrow. Subject to civil liability for damages to all affected properties. Stop. Brennan Hoopers, Voss, and others may file. Stop, your property rights confirmed under original survey. Stop. No further proceeding required on your end. Stop. Well done. Stop. Grath. No further proceeding required. Caleb read that sentence and felt something release in his chest that he hadn't known was still clenched. Some last-held tension from the October morning when Harrow had dropped a document on a fence post and walked away whistling, from the Friday when he'd come back with his hands and his Denver lawyer, from the December hearing and the map with its 8 shifted boundary lines. It had all been coiled somewhere in him through the winter, and it released now, quietly, without fanfare, like a knot working loose in the dark. He sent a wire to Patrick Brennan. Patrick Brennan's reply came 2 days later and contained only 7 words. Thank you, stop getting the lawyer. Stop, Patrick. The spring proceeding to formally confirm the original Rowan boundary was brief and uncontested. Harrow did not appear. Fowler did not appear. The Aldridge firm did not appear because their principal surveyor was cooperating with the territory and the firm's remaining partners had suspended operations pending the investigation. Crane, the Denver lawyer, had apparently returned to Denver with no comment. Alderton looked at the original 1871 survey, looked at Caleb's chain of title, looked at the confirmation from the Attorney General's office, and signed the order in 11 minutes. The creek was theirs. It had always been theirs. Now it was theirs in every document that would ever matter, in perpetuity, with the weight of the territorial court and the Attorney General behind it. Caleb and Naomi walked out of the Cheyenne courthouse into the April air, which was a different animal entirely from the December air they had walked out into after the injunction hearing, warmer, carrying the particular smell of a plains spring, the world opening up rather than closing down. Naomi stopped at the top of the courthouse steps and turned her face up to the sun for a moment, which was something he had never seen her do before. Not a performance of relief, just receiving it. The warmth on her face after a long cold. He stood beside her and didn't say anything for a moment, and then said, "You should know that I've been thinking about what to plant in the South Garden this year." She opened her eyes and looked at him. "You mentioned in January that you'd like a kitchen garden," he said. "I was thinking tomatoes if we put them against the south wall. Maybe beans." She looked at him with an expression he had learned to read correctly, which was not neutrality, but its opposite, everything present, held lightly. "You remembered that," she said. "I remember most things you say," he said. "I'm just not always immediate about responding to them." "I've noticed," she said. But she was smiling when she said it, the full smile that had taken 2 months to arrive and that he had never quite gotten accustomed to, because it was the kind of smile that assumed nothing and offered everything. And in his experience, those were the rarest kind. They went home. The South Garden went in on the 3rd week of April. Naomi had her sleeves rolled up and dirt on her hands by 8 in the morning, working the bed against the south wall of the house, where the winter sun had kept the ground from freezing as deep as the open pasture. Elsie had appointed herself assistant, which primarily involved asking questions about each seed and providing observations about the soil that were largely inaccurate but delivered with great authority. Caleb was mending fence on the north side when he heard them, the low sound of Naomi's voice and the higher sound of Elsie's questions. And he stopped working for a moment and listened without being able to make out the words. Just the cadence, question, answer, question, a pause, a different kind of answer. And something in the pattern of it settled into him like the warmth settled into the ground that April, slow and patient and changing things at a depth where the change would last. He had not replaced what he lost. You do not replace things that matter. You carry them, and you carry them for a long time, and eventually you find that you are strong enough to carry more than one thing at once, which is not replacement, but is its own kind of grace. He had thought, in the worst of the grief, that the capacity for this, for warmth, for the particular attention you pay to a person you love, for wanting the future rather than just arriving at it, had been spent, used up. That Margaret had taken it with her, not intentionally, but the way fire takes everything in a room when it goes out, leaving only the cold. He had been wrong. Not about the grief. The grief was real, and he still carried it, and probably always would, the way you carry the shape of a room you have lived in even after you have left it. But about the capacity. It had not been spent. It had been waiting, without his knowing it, the way the south ground waits through winter for the sun to come back around to the right angle. He went back to mending the fence. Later, at supper, Elsie reported that they had planted tomatoes and beans and something Naomi called sweet peas that Elsie was skeptical about because they didn't sound like food. "They're flowers," Naomi said. "They smell good." "Papa doesn't like flowers," Elsie said with the absolute confidence of a child reporting established fact. "I don't dislike flowers," Caleb said. "You never planted any." "That doesn't mean I dislike them. That means I was busy." Elsie considered this distinction, found it technically defensible, and let it go. Then she said, "Naomi says the tomatoes won't be ready until August." "That's probably right," Caleb said. "That's a long time." "Gardens take patience," Naomi said. Elsie looked at the window in the direction of the south wall, as though she could see through it to the garden, and was deciding how she felt about the waiting. "All right," she said, with the air of someone conceding a point she intends to revisit. "But I want to be the one who picks the first one." "Deal," Naomi said. Elsie nodded, satisfied, and went back to her supper. Caleb looked at his daughter, and then at his wife across the table, and the lamp burned between them, and the ranch was quiet around the house, with the particular quiet of a spring evening when the day's work is done and the next day's work has not yet begun. Victor Harrow was gone from Red Hollow before summer. Not dramatically. There was no moment of public reckoning, no scene on the main street with the town assembled. He simply sold the operation in May, quietly and quickly, to a cattle company out of Denver that had no history in the county and no particular interest in the water rights disputes of the previous owner. The sale price, according to Otis Pratt, who had heard it from the buyer's representative, was considerably below what the property was worth. The civil liability filings from the Brennan family and the Hoopers and Samuel Voss in Laramie County were the mechanism that made the sale happen. Patrick Brennan's lawyer, energized by the Attorney General's fraud finding, had assembled a damages claim that Harrow's remaining legal representation had assessed as likely to succeed, and the resulting calculation, pay the lawyers and probably lose, or sell and pay and retain something, had apparently resolved in the direction of selling. It was not poetic justice. It was arithmetic, which is what justice most often looks like when it arrives, without drama, without the clarity of a verdict, just the slow compounding of consequence until a man's options run out. Helen Marsh told Naomi about the sale on a Tuesday in May at Otis Pratt's store, in the same aisle where Helen had once told her about the Brennan dispute and the Aldridge firm and a benchmark error that turned out to matter. Naomi came home and told Caleb, who was at the south fence, the same fence where the original telegram had arrived, where Harrow had delivered the fraudulent survey, where it had all begun. He listened. Then he said, "Patrick Brennan get anything?" Helen didn't know the amount, but Grath confirmed the settlement was reached. Caleb looked at the fence line and at the south pasture beyond it, green now in the May light, and at the creek running full with the snowmelt, exactly where it had always been, exactly where his father had staked the water rights in 1871, because he understood that water mattered more than almost anything else. "Good," he said. It was a small word for what it contained, but Caleb was a man who had learned over a hard couple of years that the small words usually held more than the large ones, and that the things worth keeping were usually the things that did not require much explaining. Naomi stood beside him at the fence. The May afternoon was warm in a way that Wyoming afternoons in May sometimes are, genuinely warm, not a tease, the kind of warmth that means it's going to stay. The creek made its sound through the south pasture, and the cattle were where they were supposed to be, and somewhere behind them the house sat solid and sealed and inhabited, with a kitchen garden against the south wall that would not be ready until August. "He's gone," she said. "He is." "Does it feel like anything, now that it's actually done?" He thought about it honestly, the way she always invited him to think about things, which was one of the things he had come to value most about her. She asked real questions and waited for real answers. "It feels like getting a splinter out," he said. "You forget how much it was bothering you until it's not there anymore. And then you feel the absence of the irritation and realize the irritation had been there so long you'd stopped noticing it." She looked at him. "That's the least romantic way to describe the resolution of a 5-month legal battle I've ever heard." "Did you want romantic?" "No," she said. "I wanted honest. That was honest." He looked at the creek, at the green of the south pasture, at the sky above the valley, which was the specific blue of a Wyoming May that always surprised him when it arrived, vivid and wide and without apology. "It's over," he said. Not for her, just saying it, making it real in the way that things become real when you say them. It's over, she agreed. Summer arrived with the certainty that Wyoming summers have, hot and dry and enormous, the sky bigger than any other season, the work unrelenting in the way that ranch work in summer always is, but satisfying in the direct equation of effort and outcome that Caleb had built his life around. The cattle put on weight. The north pasture came up better than the previous year. The fence that had been neglected through the worst of the grief years was properly repaired, section by section, through June and July. Naomi ran the house and the accounts and had opinions, as she had warned him she would, about both. She was right often enough that he stopped qualifying his acceptance of her opinions with reminders that the final decision was his, because the qualification had become meaningless, and they both knew it. She made decisions about the ranch, and he made decisions about the ranch, and when they disagreed, they argued about it in the specific register of people who respect each other too much to pretend they agree when they don't, and then they resolved it and moved on. It was not a smooth marriage. It was not a marriage of two people who always understood each other or never frustrated each other or had arrived at the same place in life at the same speed. It was a marriage of two imperfect people who had been handed each other by accident and had decided, separately and then together, that the accident was better than anything they would have chosen deliberately. In early August, Elsie came running to the house from the south garden in the late afternoon with something in both hands, cupped like water, and she came through the kitchen door and opened her hands on the table, and there was a tomato. Small, the first one, dark red, and slightly misshapen, the way the first tomatoes of a garden often are. Naomi was at the stove. She turned and looked. Elsie said, "I picked it. You said I could pick the first one." "You did," Naomi said. "That's the first one." Elsie looked at it in her hands with the expression she reserved for things she had been waiting for and that had finally arrived, and then looked up at both of them. "Can we eat it now?" she asked. "That's generally what tomatoes are for," Caleb said. Elsie carried it to the table like something ceremonial, and Naomi sliced it with the kitchen knife and put it on a plate with a little salt, the way her own mother had done. And the three of them stood around the kitchen table in the August afternoon and ate the first tomato from the first garden of the new life. And it tasted like a tomato, which is to say, it tasted exactly like itself, which is the best thing anything can taste like. Elsie ate her portion and then said, "I knew from the station." Caleb looked at her. "Knew what from the station?" "That she was the right one." Elsie said it with the serene certainty of a person confirming something that has never been in question for them. "When she came off the train, I knew." Naomi looked at Caleb. He looked back. "You were 5 years old," Naomi said. "I know," Elsie said. "I still knew." Caleb thought about the platform, the steam, the woman stepping down with her single bag, and her careful face, and her hat that was too good for Red Hollow, and her eyes that read a situation in 30 seconds. He thought about Elsie running across the platform and taking her hand and saying, "I think you were supposed to come instead," with the absolute gravity of a 5-year-old who has decided something and means it. He thought about the fact that everyone else in the arrangement had been uncertain, the agency, sending their second choice. Naomi, arriving into an unknown. Himself, standing on a platform in his better shirt waiting for a woman he had not chosen and did not know how to need. All of them uncertain, working from incomplete information, making provisional decisions they would have to revise. Except Elsie, who had not had the machinery for uncertainty yet, who had looked at a stranger stepping off a train and recognized something the rest of them would take months to see. There is a kind of wisdom in that which has nothing to do with age or experience. It lives in people who have not yet learned to protect themselves from wanting things, who have not yet put the distance between themselves and the truth that adults put there for good reasons that turn out sometimes to be bad ones. Children see it plain. The rest of us work our way back to it through the long route of evidence and caution and the specific education of being wrong enough times to stop mistrusting what we know. Caleb had come to what he knew the long way. He did not regret the route. The route was what made the arrival feel like what it was. He looked at his daughter and then at his wife and then at the plate with its last slice of the first tomato of the first garden, and he said, "You were right," and meant it toward both of them, about everything it could possibly mean. Elsie picked up the last slice of tomato with her fingers, which was bad table manners, and she knew it and did it anyway. "I know," she said. Outside, the creek ran through the south pasture in the August afternoon, steady and unremarkable, and entirely where it belonged. The mountains stood at the edge of the valley the way they had always stood, indifferent to the arrangements of the people below them, patient in the way that only very old things can be patient. The sky above Red Hollow was the blue that has no argument in it, open and clear, and wide enough to hold whatever a person brings to it. Some things begin as mistakes: the wrong letter, the wrong name, the wrong bride arriving on the right train. And some mistakes are the most accurate thing that ever happened to you, because accuracy is not always about choosing correctly from the start. Sometimes it is about what you do with what you were given, how you hold it, whether you have the patience and the honesty and the plain stubbornness to work it into something true. Naomi Ashford had not been what Caleb Rowan chose. She had been what arrived. And what arrived had turned out to be the person who stood beside him on a porch when a man with lawyers and fraudulent surveys came to take what was his, who found the error in the document at midnight, who held his daughter's hand through a fever and sealed the gaps in the walls, and wrote the letters that needed writing and said, "It's my ranch too," as though it had always been true and she was merely acknowledging a fact, which, as it turned out, it had. And she was. The agency had called it a substitution, had apologized for the inconvenience, had trusted it would prove satisfactory. It had proved something considerably beyond satisfactory, which is the nature of the things you did not plan for and cannot explain and would not trade, the things that come sideways, through a door you didn't know you'd left open, and sit down at your table and turn out to be exactly what the table was waiting for. Elsie had known it from the station. The rest of them had just taken a little longer to catch up,